In my 35 years on the bench in Providence, Rhode Island, I thought I had seen every kind of surprise a courtroom could hold. Let me tell you something, my friends. If this touches your heart, leave a comment before we even begin, because nothing prepared me for the morning. A yoga instructor named Karen stepped before me, looked at the prosecutor, looked at Inspector Quinn, and then folded herself into a full downward dog right there on the courtroom floor. People gasped. One woman laughed. I didn't, because the moment I saw her eyes, I knew this was not going to be about yoga. It was going to be about pain, pride, and the thin line between law and mercy. I remember the courtroom exactly as it was that day. The fluorescent lights were a little too bright. The winter air kept sneaking in every time the door opened. Inspector Quinn stood where he always stood, steady as a lighthouse, with that expression he gets when something unusual's about to happen and he's trying not to enjoy it too much. The clerk had a stack of files in front of her, and one of them was thicker than it should have been for municipal matter. That file belonged to Karen. Now, I've always believed that before you judge someone, you ought to look at them carefully, not with suspicion alone, not with softness alone, with honesty. A judge who only looks at paper will miss the person. A judge who only looks at emotion will miss the truth. And so when Karen walked up to the podium, I did what I've done for decades. I watched. She was in her early 40s, maybe a little older, blonde hair tied back in a hurried knot. Not the neat kind you do in front of a mirror, but the kind you twist together in a parking lot because life has already started throwing punches before breakfast. She had a canvas bag over her shoulder with a rolled yoga mat tucked through the strap. Her coat was decent, but worn at the cuffs. Her sneakers were clean, though the soles had flattened in that way I've seen on people who stand all day for a living. Her jaw was tight, her eyes were tired and proud. That pride told me something right away. She was scared of being embarrassed. Let me ask you something. Haven't you noticed that sometimes the people who come into court sounding the most defensive are the ones who feel the most ashamed? They get loud because they are trying not to fall apart. They argue because they think if they stop talking, the whole truth is going to spill out and drown them. So I look down at the say necessitates, citations sadis gone, improper parking in a clearly marked loading zone, operating a commercial activity in a public plaza without a permit, creating a public disturbance, 3 separate municipal violations from the same morning. Added with penalties, the total was enough to sting somebody who was doing well and enough to knock the wind out of somebody who wasn't. I looked back up at her. "Good morning," I said. She tried to answer confidently, but it came out thin. "Good morning, Your Honor. I sir, dasi nice bay demo. Aski today and I surely if Sadef she baski name she was Karen Miller." She said yes. The prosecutor summarized the matter. According to the reporting officer, Ms. Miller had parked her vehicle in a loading zone outside a Providence Community Plaza during business hours, set up an unsanctioned group yoga class, ignored instructions to relocate, and caused a scene when an officer attempted to issue citations. The prosecutor said witnesses described her as dramatic, combative, and performative. The word performative stayed with me because I've heard a lot of words thrown at people in that courtroom. Some of them are accurate, some of them are lazy, and sometimes the difference between those two is the difference between justice and cruelty. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to see more stories from my courtroom, because moments like this remind us that the smallest cases can hold the biggest truths. I turned to Karen and said, "All right, ma'am, tell me what happened." She took a breath, then another. Then she said, "The kind of sentence that tells a judge the day is about to become very interesting." She said, "Your Honor, I can explain it better if I show you. Now, I've been doing this for 35 years, and whenever somebody tells me they can explain something better by showing me, I prepare myself for trouble. Sometimes it's a motorist trying to recreate an accident with hand gestures. Sometimes it's a landlord pulling photographs out of a supermarket bag. Sometimes it's a teenager who thinks the courtroom is a stage." I said, "You're going to have to use your words." She nodded, but she was already nervous, already half lost in whatever storm was moving through her. She looked at the officer's statement. She looked at the people in the gallery. She looked at me, and before anyone could quite understand what she intended, she set down her bag, stepped to the side of the podium, bent forward, placed both palms on the courtroom floor, and lifted herself into a perfect textbook downward dog. Right there in my courtroom. There was a beat of complete silence, then a muffled cough from the back row, then a laugh somebody tried to swallow. Then Quinn gave me that look that said, "Judge, this one's yours." Karen, still upside down, said, "This is what I was doing when the officer said I was resisting. Well, I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for half a second because sometimes that's the only thing a judge can do when life hands him a moment like that. Then I said, "Ma'am, in this courtroom people rise for the judge, they don't invert for him." The room laughed and she snapped upright with embarrassment flooding her face. That was the first crack in her armor. She grabbed her bag, stepped back to the podium and said, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. When I get nervous, I don't always explain myself the right way." And suddenly the laughter in the room disappeared because now everyone could hear it, the shaking in her voice, the humiliation, the effort it was taking not to cry. I softened my tone. "That's all right," I told her. "Take a breath. Start from the beginning." She did. She said she was a yoga instructor, not one of those expensive boutique people. She added quickly, as if she had spent enough time being judged to anticipate every assumption before it was spoken. She taught at a small studio 3 days a week, rented church basement space for low-cost community classes, and volunteered on Friday mornings at a women's recovery center. The class in question, she said, had been a free outdoor session for caregivers and women dealing with grief. No admission, no money box, no products. No business signage except a folding paper sign with the words "Breathe, Stretch, Heal." That got my attention, so I looked back at the citation and asked the prosecutor, "Where's the commercial activity?" He pointed to the officer's report, which noted that business cards had been present and that the defendant was promoting her services. Karen interrupted, not angrily but urgently. "My cards were in my bag, Your Honor. I carry them everywhere. I wasn't selling anything." I held up a hand to slow the room down. Then I asked her why she was parked in the loading zone. That's when her eyes changed. Not angry, not defensive, wounded. She said, "Because I was late to the class, and because my mother had just come out of dialysis, and because I made a terrible decision. Now we were getting somewhere." She told me her mother had been in a clinic 2 blocks away that morning. She had taken her there before sunrise. One of the aides called to say her mother was weak, disoriented, and refusing to wait for transportation. Karen said she drove over, got her settled with a neighbor for an hour, then raced to the plaza because 12 women were already there, waiting in the cold for a class she had promised would help them breathe through panic and grief. She paused before she said the next part. "I told myself I'd only leave the car there for 10 minutes. How many human mistakes begin with that sentence? I've only leave it there for 10 minutes. I'm only going inside for 1 second. I'm only trying to get through one bad morning." You see, the law often catches us at the exact moment our intentions collide with reality. That's why being a judge requires more than memorizing statutes. It requires understanding the little bargains people make with themselves when life is squeezing them from both sides. I asked her, "And the disturbance?" She swallowed hard. "One of the women in the class started having a panic attack when the officer raised his voice. I got down on the ground to show her how to breathe. I told her to look at me and follow my posture. That's what he saw." Inspector Quinn actually turned his head at that one. Because suddenly, the downward dog in the officer's report didn't look like insolence. It looked like triage. But I wasn't finished. I never make up my mind too early. I asked to see the officer's full statement, and when I looked at the date, the time, and the location, I noticed something else. The clinic she mentioned really was nearby. The time on the ticket was just 14 minutes after the class had supposedly begun. The photographs attached to the citation showed a cardboard sign, 6 yoga mats, thermoses, and a circle of women in winter coats. No cash box, no merchandise, no sales table, just a bad parking choice and a mess that had escalated. If you believe people deserve to be seen in full, hit that like button because what happened next changed the whole weight of that morning. I asked Karen, "Were you polite to the officer?" She looked down. Now when somebody looks down like that, I pay attention. Shame has a language. And after all these years, I know how to hear it. She said quietly, "Not right away." That answer mattered to me. People think judges are looking for perfect defendants. I'm not. Perfect people don't come to court. Honest people do. Or at least I hope they do. The quickest way for somebody to lose me is to make themselves a saint when the facts say otherwise. So I leaned forward and said, "Tell me the truth." She nodded. I said he was escalating the energy of a healing space. Even the prosecutor smirked. I said, "That sounds like something a yoga instructor would say." A little laughter came back into the room, but this time it was gentler. Even Karen gave a small, embarrassed smile. Then she added, and when he said I was obstructing municipal activity, I told him he was obstructing inner peace. Now I had to press my lips together to keep from laughing. What am I going to do with you? That's what I thought, though I didn't say it yet, because humor can be useful in court, but only if it doesn't become humiliation. A judge has to know the difference. I asked her, "Did you refuse to move your vehicle?" She said no. She said by the time the officer demanded it, he had already begun writing the ticket. And then one of the women in class started crying so hard she thought the woman might faint. Karen said that was when she got down on the ground to demonstrate breathing and grounding. She admitted the whole thing looked ridiculous. She admitted it probably looked defiant, but she insisted she had not been trying to mock anyone. Something in her eyes told me she was telling the truth. Not the whole truth yet, but the important truth. Then the prosecutor cleared his throat and said words I did not particularly want to hear. "Your Honor, there is also prior history. That can change a case in a hurry." He handed up a printout. 2 prior parking citations over the last 18 months. 1 expired registration penalty. 1 late fee matter sent to collections and then partially paid. Nothing criminal, nothing violent, nothing wicked, but enough to tell me this wasn't simply one isolated bad morning. There was a pattern of disorder. And the moment I saw Karen realize I was reading that history, her shoulders fell. Sometimes that's when the real hearing begins, because now the defendant understands that the judge sees not only this moment, but the trail behind it. And now she has to decide whether she's going to keep performing or finally tell the truth she's been protecting. I said, "You've had some trouble keeping up with these obligations." She nodded, but she didn't speak. I said, "Oh, why?" Still silence. So I lowered my voice. "Ma'am, I can't help you unless you help me understand." Her throat moved, her hands tightened around the strap of that canvas bag. Then I noticed for the first time that her knuckles were red and slightly cracked, as if she'd been scrubbing things in cold water. Not manicured hands, working hands. She said, "Because I'm drowning." You could feel the entire courtroom listen. She told me the studio she taught at had cut her hours. Half her private clients disappeared after the pandemic. Her divorce had been final for less than a year. Her ex-husband had moved out of state and sent support late when he sent it at all. Her mother's medical needs had grown. Her teenage daughter needed rides, lunch money, school supplies, attention stability, all the things children deserve and don't stop deserving just because the adults around them are exhausted. Then she said something I still remember exactly. "I teach people how to breathe, Your Honor, and some days I forget how to do it myself." That's a line I could never forget, because in that one sentence, she stopped being the woman who did downward dog in court and became what she really was: a tired daughter, a worried mother, a professional trying to hold herself together with the very tools she gave away to other people. This reminded me of my own father. My father came to this country from Italy. He didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Immigrant families know something about dignity under pressure. They know how people smile with pain in their backs and fear in their stomachs because there are children watching. They know how pride can keep a person standing long after their strength is gone. And sitting on that bench listening to Karen, I thought of the men and women I grew up around, people who would never describe themselves as heroes, though they carried burdens that would break stronger-looking people in half. But compassion doesn't cancel responsibility. That's the line a judge has to walk. I said, "All right, I understand struggle, but let me ask you something. What about the prior tickets? Were those also bad mornings?" She wiped her face and gave me the most useful answer in the world. The truthful one. One was outside the hospital when my mother had a complication. One was because my registration lapsed while I was deciding whether to fix my transmission or pay rent, and one was because I missed the notice and then I was too embarrassed to deal with it. That last part mattered too. People underestimate how much damage embarrassment does. It keeps letters unopened, bills unpaid, phone calls unanswered. And then what began as a small problem multiplies simply because the person is too ashamed to face it. I asked her if she had proof regarding her mother's treatment. She reached into her bag immediately and handed up papers so neatly folded I knew she had brought them because she'd been living with the fear of not being believed. Dialysis schedules, appointment summaries, billing statements with amounts circled in pen, even a repair estimate for a car. I looked at them and my heart sank a little, because there it was, the arithmetic of hardship, not dramatic enough for headlines, just relentless. Medical co-pays, utility notices, car trouble, tuition balance, late fee, another late fee. Life doesn't always destroy people with one great tragedy. Sometimes it does it with 30 small invoices. Before I tell you what I did with those papers, leave a comment if you've ever seen someone look strong on the outside while quietly carrying a world of hurt on the inside. I was still weighing everything when I noticed movement in the gallery. A young girl, maybe 14 or 15, sat 2 rows back with both hands clasped around her own elbows. She had the same eyes Karen had, only younger and more frightened. Inspector Quinn noticed me noticing her and gave a slight nod as if to say, yes, she came in with her. I asked Karen who that was. She turned and said, that's my daughter Ellie. I said, did you bring her here? Karen looked ashamed again. I had nobody to leave her with. I asked the girl how old she was. 15, she said. There is something about hearing a child's voice in a courtroom that changes the air. All of a sudden, the consequences stop being numbers on paper. They become meals, bus rides, winter coats, school mornings, phone bills, the 1,000 invisible hinges on which a household swings. I asked Ellie, why did you come with your mother today? She looked at her mother first, as if seeking permission. Karen shook her head lightly, maybe not wanting to burden the child, maybe not wanting her drawn into public difficulty, but the girl answered anyway. I wanted you to know she helps people. Just like that, no rehearsed speech, no theatrics, just a child telling the judge the one truth she couldn't bear to have omitted. I said, how does she help people? The girl took a breath. She teaches free classes for girls who are anxious and for women at the recovery house, and sometimes she doesn't take money when people can't pay, and she stays up with my grandmother at night and still gets up in the morning. Karen put her hand over her face. I had to pause for a moment. Because children don't give character references the way adults do. Adults defend, children reveal, and the relief, love, and fear in that young girl's voice told me more about Karen than 3 affidavits ever could. The prosecutor wasn't a bad man. He had seen enough life to know when a case was shifting from paperwork to humanity. He didn't object. He didn't posture. He just stood there and listened. That kind of silence deserves respect. I looked over at Quinn. He gave me one of those almost invisible expressions that said, Judge, you're not being manipulated here. This is real. Still, I had to ask the hard question. Karen, if I believe all of this, what am I supposed to do about the fact that you were wrong? Now, that's the heart of judging, not whether someone is sympathetic. Lots of sympathetic people break rules. The question is, what kind of response honors both the law and the life in front of you? She surprised me with her answer. She said, hold me accountable. Just don't flatten me. That's wisdom. Real wisdom doesn't come wrapped in polished language. It comes in plain words from people who've run out of vanity. Hold me accountable. Just don't flatten me. I repeated it softly. Then I asked her why the officer described her as combative. She said, because I was angry that morning. Not at him, at everything. And he got the part of me that had nothing left. There are moments in court when I can feel an entire room recognizing itself in somebody else's confession. This was one of those moments. Who hasn't spoken sharply to the wrong person on the wrong day? Who hasn't let a stranger receive the spillover from a private grief? Of course, the officer had a job to do. I wasn't going to forget that. So I asked whether the officer was present. He wasn't. But there was body camera notation attached to the report, summarized in the file. I asked the clerk to read the relevant portion. It indicated the defendant became visibly upset, repeatedly said she was trying to calm a participant in distress, and apologized at the scene before leaving. Apologized. That mattered. Not because apology erases conduct, it doesn't, but because remorse tells a judge whether there is room for mercy without wasting it. Let me tell you something, my friends. Subscribe if you believe justice works best when it sees both the rule that was broken and the heart that's trying to mend. I asked Karen whether she had ever followed up with the officer. She said yes. What did you do? She reached into her bag again and pulled out a copy of a handwritten note. I read it silently first, then again. In it, she apologized for making a public servant's job harder. She said the officer had met her on one of the worst mornings of her year. She enclosed complimentary passes for a breathing and mobility class for first responders, explaining that stress lands in the body before it lands in behavior. Now that to me was extraordinary, not because it was fancy, because it was decent. A lot of people want understanding but never extend it. Karen had been cited, embarrassed, financially strained, and still she had found a way to honor the humanity of the man who ticketed her. That told me who she was when she was at her best, but I was still troubled. The prior citations remained. The registration issue remained. The loading zone was clearly marked. The city cannot function if everyone decides their emergency is the only emergency. If a firefighter needed that lane, excuses wouldn't matter much. I have to remember that. A judge who forgets the public becomes dangerous in a different way. So I sat back and thought, and when I think on the bench, I often hear my father's values in my mind. Work hard. Tell the truth. Don't humiliate people. Don't excuse carelessness. And when mercy is possible, make it meaningful. Meaningful mercy is not the same as easy mercy. Easy mercy teaches nothing. Meaningful mercy restores dignity and responsibility at the same time. I looked at Karen and said, "If I give you a break today, what's going to be different next month?" She answered so fast I knew she had been asking herself the same thing every night. "My registration is current as of last week. I borrowed money from my cousin and fixed it. I'm moving my mother in with us so I can cut transportation costs. I got approval to teach at the senior center twice a week, and I'm applying for a permit for spring outdoor classes so this doesn't happen again." Now I was interested. I asked for proof of the registration. She had it. I asked for the senior center letter. She had that too. Not polished, not lawyered, but real. The director of the senior center wrote that Karen had volunteered to run gentle movement classes for seniors recovering from falls, grief, and isolation. The letter said participants were already asking for her by name after a trial session. There it was again. Not somebody trying to wriggle out of accountability. Somebody trying desperately to become more than her mistakes. That is the kind of person I want to help. But then came the twist that took the whole case somewhere deeper. The clerk, who had been sorting papers, handed up one more document that had been clipped behind the officer's materials. It was a follow-up memo, a small thing, easy to miss. In it, the officer noted that after the incident, one of the women from the yoga group contacted the department to say Karen had stayed with her during a panic episode until family arrived. The woman specifically requested that officers understand Karen had been trying to save me from spiraling, not trying to make a scene. When I heard that, my throat tightened, because now the absurd image everyone would remember, the downward dog in court, the yoga instructor on the pavement, the public weirdness of it all was standing beside a much bigger truth. Someone had been in distress. Karen had responded, messily, imperfectly, inconveniently, maybe even foolishly from a parking standpoint, but she had responded. And that, my friends, is where life becomes hard to reduce to a citation. I looked out at the gallery and saw several people leaning forward. One woman had already started wiping her eyes. The prosecutor looked down at his own table for a moment. Quinn crossed his arms and tilted his head, the way he does when he knows the whole courtroom is holding its breath for what comes next. Before I tell you what I decided, hit that like button if you believe second chances should come with wisdom, not weakness. Now, I want to be honest with you. There are judges who would have simply dismissed everything and enjoyed being called compassionate. There are judges who would have imposed every fine and called that integrity. I don't believe either extreme serves justice very well. Mercy without structure can become sentimentality. Structure without mercy can become vanity wearing a robe. So, I began talking through it the way I sometimes do, partly for the defendant and partly for everyone else listening. I said, "Ms. Miller, you were wrong to park in that loading zone. I don't care how stressful your morning was. Public safety rules are not suggestions. You also handled the officer poorly in the beginning. You know that, and I know that." She nodded. I continued, "But I also see a woman who is carrying a sick mother, raising a daughter, working for very little, serving people who are struggling and making bad decisions in the middle of a good heart. That matters to me." She started crying then, but very quietly, as if trying not to deserve kindness too loudly. I said, "Don't misunderstand me. Good intentions don't make bad choices disappear, but they do help me decide whether the purpose of this courtroom is to punish you or to redirect you. That's one of the most important things I've learned in all my years. Punishment is easy. Redirection is harder. Punishment ends at the gavel. Redirection can change a life." I asked Ellie to stand with her mother for a moment. The girl came forward hesitantly. Karen looked mortified, but I had a reason. I wanted that young girl to hear not just the outcome, but the principle. Children who grow up around hardship need to hear adults in authority say that mistakes can be corrected without a person being discarded. I said to Karen, "Your daughter speaks very highly of you." Karen shook her head and said, "She deserves better." I answered immediately, "Maybe. Every child deserves the moon. But let me tell you something. Showing up, fighting, apologizing, and trying again, that counts for a lot in this courtroom." That line landed hard in the room. Because it's true. We have built a culture that sometimes talks as if people are only their worst moment. I reject that. A person is the sum of what they did, what they suffered, what they learned, and what they choose next. I looked back at the paperwork and made my decision. I found her responsible on the parking violation. I dismissed the commercial activity citation for lack of persuasive evidence. I reduced the disturbance matter to a nominal court cost based on the body camera summary and her apology at the scene. Then I told her I was going to do something a little different with the remaining financial penalty. She looked up through tears. So did everyone else. I said, "Here is your sentence, and yes, it may be a little savage." Even Quinn smiled at that. I continued, "For the next 8 Saturdays, you are going to teach a free mobility and breathing class at the senior center you brought to my attention. You are going to do it on time, with a permit where necessary, and with proof of attendance signed by the director. If you complete that, keep your registration current, and stay violation-free for 90 days, I will waive the balance of this fine." Karen stared at me like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. The room was silent again. Then I added, "And one more thing. No downward dog in my courtroom ever again. We clear?" The courtroom burst into laughter. This time Karen laughed too, right through the tears. She said, "Yes, Your Honor." I said, "Because if you do it again, I'll sentence you to tree pose through the whole calendar." That got Quinn. He actually laughed out loud, but humor only matters if it delivers truth. So I turned serious again. I said, "Listen to me carefully. The city needs order. Your family needs stability. The people you teach need your best self, not the version of you that's running on fumes and calling that spirituality. You can't preach balance and live in chaos. Do you understand?" She nodded so hard she almost couldn't speak. Yes, I do." Then I said what I'd been thinking from the moment her daughter spoke. "You're a good person having a hard time, but good people still have to get organized." Now that is a sentence I wish more people would hear early in life, because goodness is not a management system. Character matters, but so do calendars, registrations, deadlines, sleep, asking for help, and not waiting until disaster is your only motivation. Compassion without structure burns out. Service without boundaries collapses. Love without order becomes panic in slow motion. Karen placed a hand over her mouth. Ellie began crying openly now, and I could see in their faces the strange relief that sometimes comes when a person expects humiliation and receives accountability wrapped in dignity instead. If this story means something to you, share it with someone who needs hope. Because what happened after that decision stayed with me long after the courtroom emptied. You might think that was the end of it. It wasn't. A few moments after I announced the disposition, Karen said, "Your Honor, may I say one thing?" Usually when someone asks that after a decision, I brace myself. Sometimes they want to relitigate. Sometimes they want the last word. Sometimes they want sympathy one more time. But her tone was different. I said, "Go ahead." She turned slightly toward the gallery, then back to me, and said, "I know people like to laugh at women like me and call us crazy or dramatic or Karen. I know how this looks. But that morning, I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was trying to keep one woman from collapsing and myself from shattering with her." That sentence hit me hard, because labels are cheap. Human beings are not. We live in a time when people can be turned into a type before anyone bothers to learn their name. Entitled, difficult, emotional, soft, broken, toxic, weak, too much, not enough. And once that label sticks, the world starts feeling permitted to stop being curious. Curiosity is one of the great moral acts. A judge must remain curious, not gullible, curious. So I said to her, "The world may label you in a second. This courtroom will take a little longer." That is one of the quotable things I've said that day, and I meant every word. The prosecutor nodded. The clerk looked up from her papers. Even Quinn's face softened. I told Karen to take care of herself, take care of her mother, and take care of that daughter. I told Ellie her mother had some work to do, but she also had reason to be proud. Then, because I am who I am, and because I believe blessings matter even when spoken in a courtroom, I said, "God bless you both." The relief in Karen's face when I said that, I won't forget it. You could actually see the fear draining out of her shoulders. That is another thing people don't understand about court. Most people who stand in front of a judge are not just afraid of money or consequences, they are afraid of being reduced. They are afraid that the institution will look at them and confirm their darkest private fear, that they are failures, nuisances, disappointments, burdens. When a judge resists doing that, something healing can happen even in the middle of correction. After the case ended, the room buzzed, the way it sometimes does when people have witnessed something more important than the paperwork suggested. The next matter was called, and court continued. But I'll be honest with you, a part of my mind stayed with Karen. I kept thinking about the image of her on that courtroom floor, not because it was funny, though it was, because it was revealing. When panic and misunderstanding met authority, she went to the one language everybody knew. Breathe, fold, ground, survive. Everyone else saw theatrics. I saw a person whose coping mechanism had become public at the worst possible moment. How many people are judged for the shape their survival takes? I've seen it 1,000 times. A man speaks too loudly because that's how fear sounds in his body. A woman seems cold because she has cried all the tears she can spare for 1 week. A teenager smirks because shame has taught him to wear arrogance like body armor. If you only judge the surface, you become blind to the wound. That afternoon, during a short recess, Quinn came over and said, "That was a new one." I smiled and said, "Even after all these years, they still find ways to surprise me." He chuckled, then his face turned thoughtful. "You did right by her," he said. "Now, Quinn is not sentimental. That's one reason I value him. When a person like that says you did right, it means something." I answered, "I hope so, because let me tell you something important. Judges are not infallible. We do our best. We listen, we weigh, we decide. But every case involves a private question you can never completely answer. Did I see enough? Did I see clearly? Did I help where I should help and hold firm where I should hold firm?" That humility keeps a judge honest. And if this touches your heart, leave a comment telling me whether you think justice should always punish first or whether sometimes it ought to heal first. Weeks passed. Court moved on, as it always does. More tickets, more arguments, more stories. Nobody would believe if they hadn't happened in plain daylight. But every now and then I found myself wondering whether Karen would do what she promised. That matters too. Mercy is a kind of investment. You hope it grows. You fear it may be wasted. Then one Friday, my clerk brought me an envelope. Inside was a letter from the senior center director. She wrote that Karen had not only completed the 8 Saturday classes, but added 2 extra sessions at the request of participants. Attendance had grown each week. Several seniors who had been reluctant to leave their homes after falls or bereavement were now coming early to chat, stretch, and laugh together. One widower, the director wrote, told staff it was the first thing he had looked forward to since his wife died. I had to stop reading for a second, because there it was, the return on mercy. Not softness, not indulgence, not a judge trying to feel noble. Real civic good, real human repair. A woman redirected instead of flattened. Senior sati instead of isolated, a daughter watching her mother recover dignity not through rescue but through responsibility. That's justice at its best. There was more in the envelope. Karen had included a note of her own. She wrote that being held accountable without being humiliated had changed something in her. She said the sentence forced her to organize the very compassion she had been living chaotically. She had secured the proper city permit for outdoor classes. She had brought her mother into her home. Her daughter was helping with sign-ins at the senior center and wanted to study occupational therapy someday. She ended the note with a line that stayed with me. She wrote, "You reminded me that mercy is not the absence of consequences. It is the chance to become equal to them." Now that is wisdom, the kind of wisdom that isn't taught in law books, but ought to be. A month after that, I got one more update. The same officer who had written the original citation had attended one of Karen's first responder mobility classes. He told the senior center director he had underestimated her completely. He said what he saw that morning in the plaza looked like a scene, but what he understood later was care under stress. He didn't retract the ticket. He didn't have to. He simply saw her more fully. That mattered to me too, because justice is not only about what the judge learns, it is also about whether the system itself can remain teachable. We all need that. I need it. The prosecutor needs it. Police officers need it. Defendants need it. Viewers at home need it. A society that stops learning about one another becomes hard in all the wrong places. Before I close this story, subscribe to see more stories from my courtroom, because every now and then a case comes along that reminds me exactly why I never stopped believing in people. Months later, Karen came back to court. Not as a defendant. She came during a public session and waited until a recess. She was standing by the side wall with Ellie and an older woman in a wheelchair who I guessed immediately was her mother. She had permission from staff to say hello. Quinn waved me over with a small smile. Karen looked different, not richer, not transformed by some fairy tale, just steadier. The kind of steadiness that comes when a person has finally stopped using all their energy to brace for disaster. She introduced me to her mother, who squeezed my hand and thanked me in a voice worn thin by illness, but bright with gratitude. Ellie was taller somehow, or maybe just less afraid. Karen told me the senior classes had become a permanent program. She was now coordinating with the city properly. No new violations. Registration current. Studio hours improving. Nothing miraculous. Just progress. I like progress. Miracles are wonderful, but progress pays the rent and keeps children calm. Karen then said something that touched me in a very personal way. She said, "That day in court, when you mentioned family and order and dignity, I thought of my grandfather. He used to say that being good isn't enough if your life is spilling everywhere." I smiled. I said, "Your grandfather was right." Then she said, "I think I'd been mistaking exhaustion for virtue." Now, if you want another quotable line from that day, there it is. A lot of people do that. They believe that because they are sacrificing, they must therefore be living correctly. But sacrifice without wisdom can become chaos disguised as goodness. We have to teach people, especially generous people, that structure is not selfish. It is what allows love to last. I told her, and take care of yourself. The people who need you deserve a version of you that has some strength left. She nodded, and because I am a father and grandfather as much as I am a judge, I looked at Ellie and said, "Keep an eye on your mother. Make sure she doesn't open a yoga studio in the middle of a loading zone again." That got a laugh from all three of them. Even the mother laughed. Humor, when it is kind, seals a memory in a gentle way. As they wheeled away, I stood there for a second longer than necessary. Grateful. That's the word. After my health challenges, after all the years, after seeing how fragile life is, gratitude sits closer to the surface for me now. I'm grateful for every chance to still be there, still listening, still able to do some small good in the space I've been given. I don't take it for granted. Not the bench, not the stories, not the trust, not the opportunity to tell a frightened stranger, "You made a mistake, but you are not the mistake." That is another line I believe with all my heart. You made a mistake, but you are not the mistake. If more children heard that, fewer adults would spend their lives either collapsing under shame or hiding from it behind anger. The funny thing is, the clip of Karen doing downward dog would eventually be the thing people remembered first. That's the world we live in. People love the unusual, the absurd, the image that can be shared in 10 seconds. I understand that. It would have been easy for that case to become just another viral courtroom moment, another joke, another meme, another chance for strangers to laugh at a woman who looked like a stereotype. But the reason moments from my courtroom resonate, I think, is because we try not to stop at the laugh. We go further. We ask what hurt is hiding under the awkwardness. We ask what burden is hiding under the poor decision. We ask whether justice can still be firm without becoming blind. That's what I try to do. Every day I'm blessed to sit there. And let me tell you something, my friends. After 35 years on the bench in Providence, I have learned that the law may tell me what happened, but only humanity tells me what should happen next. That's the whole ball game. Not whether someone can quote regulations, not whether a judge can sound tough, not whether the audience gets a satisfying villain. Life is rarely that simple. Sometimes the person making the strangest impression is also the one carrying the heaviest load. Sometimes the one who looks dramatic is the one closest to breaking. Sometimes the one who made the obvious mistake is also the one most willing to turn mercy into service. And sometimes, yes, the right sentence for a yoga instructor who brought chaos into a public space is to require her to bring healing into another one. That's what made it a little savage and a little beautiful. I think of Karen when I think about labels. She arrived in my courtroom as yoga instructor Karen. By the time she left, she was a daughter, a mother, a caregiver, a teacher, a woman under pressure, a citizen who needed correction, and a soul still very much worth protecting from unnecessary shame. That fuller picture is what justice owes people. Not acquittal at any cost, not punishment for sport, recognition, then accountability, then if possible a path forward. If you ask me, that's not weakness. That's wisdom. And wisdom matters because everyone is teaching someone. Every judge teaches a courtroom what power sounds like. Every parent teaches a child what failure means. Every public servant teaches a community whether rules are instruments of order or weapons of pride. On that day, I wanted that young girl, Ellie, to learn that institutions can still carry a little heart. I wanted Karen to learn that chaos can be corrected without erasing her worth. I wanted the room to see that the person doing something absurd on the courtroom floor might still be the one keeping other people alive in ways nobody had bothered to ask about. That is why I slowed down. That is why I kept asking questions. That is why I didn't let the first impression decide the final outcome. I've said many times that I try to treat people the way I would want to be treated if I were in their place. Not excused for everything, not infantilized, not flattered. Treated fairly, treated firmly, treated as a human being whose story matters. That philosophy came from my family, from my faith, from the streets of Providence, from the hard-working people who built lives while carrying accents, debts, grief, dreams, and responsibilities heavier than outsiders ever saw. It came from knowing that dignity is one of the greatest gifts we can protect in another person. God bless the people who do that quietly every day, the clerks who listen, the officers who stay teachable, the children who tell the truth about their parents, the struggling mothers who keep showing up, the seniors who decide life is not over, the teachers who give away what kept them alive, and yes, even the judges who keep learning, case by case, that the robe means very little if there isn't a heart inside it. So, when people ask me what I remember most from that morning, it isn't the laughter, it isn't the posture, it isn't even the line about tree pose, though I admit that one still makes me smile. What I remember most is the moment Karen said, "Hold me accountable. Just don't flatten me." Because that is what so many people are really asking for when they come before the bench. See me. Correct me. But don't erase me. And whenever justice can answer that plea without betraying the law, I believe it should. Take care of yourself. Take care of the people who depend on you. Get organized if your good heart is living in disorder. Apologize when you're wrong. Accept consequences when they are deserved. And if someone in authority gives you a chance to turn a mistake into service, don't waste that grace. That grace might be the hinge your whole life swings on. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done if you were sitting where I was sitting. Would you have imposed every dollar of the fine? Would you have dismissed it all? Or would you have tried, as I did, to build a bridge between the law and the life standing in front of you? And share this if you know someone who needs hope, because the world has enough people ready to flatten one another. What it needs more of is wise accountability, the kind that says, stand up, tell the truth, do better. You're still worthy of the chance. As for Karen, the last I heard, she still teaches those senior classes. Ellie still helps sometimes. Her mother still comes when she's able. And no, thank God, there have been no more reports of courtroom yoga. That alone may qualify as a miracle in providence. God bless you. And believe me, after all these years, I thought I was prepared for anything, but nothing prepared me for what walked into my courtroom next.